Hey, y'all, welcome in, and in some cases, welcome back. This is our 31 Days of Prevention series where we come together to share information, inspiration, and motivation to increase awareness and prevent future and ongoing domestic violence. For those of you who may or may not know me, my name is Marci Batiste. I'm the executive director here at 9 Seconds, and we are a progressive nonprofit organization with a heart centered mission and a non traditional approach to domestic violence prevention. Every 9 seconds, a woman is abused or assaulted in this country, and it's simply not okay. But yet, and still, the answer is just not that simple. It's a complex problem that requires a multi-pronged approach, and for all of us to be on team united as one, to speak out against it and to stand up for one another. Today, I'm joined by Cassie Magee, who is the Associate Executive Director here at 9 Seconds. And I'm super excited that Cassie agreed to come in and do the video with me today. So I'm going to give her an opportunity to kind of introduce herself and tell you directly from the horse's mouth why this endeavor is so important to her and why her work at 9 Seconds means so much to her and to her family. So take it away, Cass.
Yes, thank you. So hello again to everyone. Again, my name is Cassie. And for me, Marci had talked to me about this dream, 9 seconds, and I immediately fell in love with it. For me, I had gone through the experience myself of having domestic violence. And one of the more important things for me about domestic violence prevention is making sure that it doesn't become a generational thing. So I have a lot of heart and passion with protecting kids, and the best way to protect kids is to save the women and enrich them with a lot of information and understanding so that they themselves can break the cycle, which will prevent the kids from also experiencing it as well. So for me, that's one of the heart and soul missions that I have with 9 seconds, alongside helping women. So that's kind of why I definitely jumped on board immediately with Marci and wanted to bring the dream to reality and start touching lives and hopefully saving lives as well.
Absolutely. So one of the things that Cassie and I were discussing during one of our recent board meetings was, what are some of the conversations that just don't get had, or some of the things that maybe have sort of a misconception about what they are, what the significance of them is. And one of the things that she and I both had experience with was protective orders, or restraint. You might call them restraining orders, orders of protection. There's, depending on where you're at in the country, they have different names for them, but essentially they all do the same thing. And basically you have to apply to the court, explain your story, and request that the court issue and grant an order against the abuser. And there's some nuances that go with that. And so while Cassie and I both utilized this resource of a protective order, they were very different and they were handled differently, even though we were both in the same state. Because I don't have children, she does. I wasn't married, she was. And so there are little nuances and different things that apply depending on your specific and unique situation. So understand, going into this conversation, our goal is not to provide you legal advice or to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. It is merely to open up a dialogue about protective orders, hopefully share our personal experiences with you all, and hopefully answer some questions maybe, or maybe put to rest some sensitivities that you may have concerning it, and give everyone sort of an outlet and an opportunity to begin to have this conversation. So I think for my situation, being single and not married, not residing in the same house with the individual, when my situation happened in 2012, and it was a unique time because the laws here in the state of Arizona were just changing to go from the point where the victim per se has to file charges against the abuser, into the realm where now, actually, here in the state of Arizona, in cases of domestic violence, the state picks up the charges, and it's actually the state versus John Doe, where when it happened to me, it was right on the cusp. I mean, literally within months of them just making that new law. And so I had some unique experiences as it came to my experience with the police after my incident, and then also with the court systems. But for me, it was an easy choice because I didn't have all those other ties that bind into this relationship. So for me, once it got physical and he almost killed me, it was like no brainer. I'm out. I'm gonna go do this. And we'll get into what the police told me and why this becomes sort of an uncomfortable conversation to have a little bit later in my story. But I want to kind of throw it over to you, Cass. Your experience when you decided to get a protective order and sort of what was the prompt that sent you kind of down that path?
Honestly, in my situation, and I think, this is one of the reasons why we thought it was so important to make a video about this topic, is because I felt threatened by my ex-husband, but at the same time, I felt like there's no way that he would do serious harm to me, even though my experiences were telling me otherwise. And I still had that sheet of love over my eyes where it's just like, I just wanted things to work out. I wanted them to not be true. And so it was actually my mom who encouraged me. She actually moved states. She moved up here to Arizona because I moved up here with him, and she knew, how volatile the relationship was. So when that final incident finally happened, she immediately was my first call. She came over and she picked me, and I only had one daughter at the time. I was pregnant with my other one, and we drove straight to the city and went through a program that the city held. So we didn't actually go into the court. And when we went there, and it's interesting as well, because when we were first setting up the foundation of 9 seconds and kind of what we wanted to look like, this is also a conversation that came up during that moment of how uncomfortable it was to go through the process and how shell shocked I was when I had to write down all the abuse along with the dates. And it made me realize that, wow, I actually am in a domestically violent situation, and it's nothing to play with. So in my experience, it was still, even though I had that moment of realization, I only had that moment of realization after I had to write everything down in order to pursue the protective order. And the only reason I got the protective order was because my mom was telling me this is what you need to do. And it turned out very well for me, because after I had the protective order is when I really realized that I needed it, because that's when we got some of the threats, and things just got very negative very quickly. And so once I finally moved and got a new place, I was so grateful that my address was protected and that I had different locations that were protected for me, like my girls' daycare as well as my work. And he did not have access to this information, because I got to a point where I was so stressed out and I couldn't sleep. I was so paranoid that I thought I would see him at every corner, and he was going to try to attack me or take the girls or just do something malicious. And some people hone it up to just being paranoid because of the situation. But for me, it was a very real thing that I had to experience during our divorce process and after the situation occurred. And that's when I realized the true necessity of having that protective order. And again, I didn't know that immediately after the situation, because I still had that blanket over my eyes where I wasn't really seeing the reality of what it was. But my mom, thank God for her, she saw the reality of what it was, and she knew that I would need that protective order. So that's kind of where I think our situations do differ a little bit, is that I had to be pushed into the protective order, and I did have to list my daughter on there. And a scary moment was when he battled the protective order, which we can get into that later, that they are able to battle those protective orders. And so that's kind of a summary, I guess, of my experience when I had to get the protective order.
So I want to kind of bounce off of one of the things that you said, and I want to really make sure that we highlight this. And one of the things that you just said was you didn't even realize that it was an abusive relationship. Like somebody else had to tell you that. And I know from our previous conversations, one of the things that you shared with me was that um, he wasn't a monster. And so I think sometimes we think that in order to be in a relationship that's considered abusive, they have to be these outrageous monsters, do the things like, you know, attack you and physically harm you, threaten to kill you. And it's not that. There's subtle nuances, and there's an escalation of threats, and there's an escalation of risk to you, and in your case, to your children. And again, that's where we kind of differ, because yours was this slow, steady buildup, and mine was more of an uphill trajectory. In other words, the relationship was much shorter. It escalated at a different rate and a different pace, and it finally ended in the physical abuse. Where yours was just this slow drain and slow grind. And I did a video yesterday about emotional abuse and narcissism and things like that. And that's the stuff where we don't realize, like you said, until I had to write it down, I didn't even conceptually grasp the fact that I was in an abusive relationship. Like people don't under, that's the big question. You know, people ask, well, why do you stay? Well, that's why. We don't always see the monster that lives inside them. We see bouts of anger or rage or things like that. And for you, like you had your daughter at the time. So talk just a little bit about, did you ever feel like she was at risk at any point up until you got the protective order? Or because I know you said you included her in that, and that's an important thing to note too. You have to, if you have children, you have to name them on the order too. Otherwise, the order only applies to you as an individual. And so it sounds like to me that you were aware of that, and you were able to do that. So talk a little bit about like what that process was with your daughter.
So the only reason why I was aware of having to add her to the protective order, so this was actually the second protective order that I had gotten against him, but it was the first time that I served it in that last situation there. So prior to that, when my daughter was still a newborn, we had gotten into this huge, I wouldn't necessarily call it an argument or a fight, because I didn't really argue or fight, but we had kind of an explosive situation, and he left. And not to get too much into detail about the situation, but him and his brother came back to the apartment, and his brother took the TV, and my ex tried to take my daughter, who again was a newborn at the time. And I had to call the police because he took my phone. You know, I used the neighbor's phone and everything. And that's when they suggested to me that I get a protective order against him and make sure I include my daughter. And the only reason they told me that is because he tried to take my daughter. And, you know, I breastfed. And so to him, for him to take her, you know, she would have access to no food. She didn't take the bottle, anything like that. So that's part of the reason why they encouraged it as well. So I did get that initial protective order, and I ended up meeting with him and talking, and he apologized. And so I never served it on him. He actually moved back in, and we continued. And again, that's part of the cycle, right? Mm-hmm. Is that forgiving and believing that it'll never happen again. And, you know, oh, they've come to a tipping point, and they've realized the error in their ways. They will never do this again. So the next big situation was the situation when we finally left. So he actually did really good for an extended amount of time up until that situation. And the reason why I put her on there is because that was the first time that I think I truly felt that he could harm her. And the situation was that, you know, he was really upset. He had been drinking, and he actually pulled a gun out on me while I was holding my daughter. And he pointed the gun at me, and my daughter was in my lap. And that was the first click moment that made me realize, when he loses his temper, he gets to a point where he, I believe, could potentially harm my daughter. Not just me, but anyone around. And outside of that, there was a point during the relationship where we were trying to work things out, and we were talking about things, and he let me know that part of the reason he will try to, like, if we had an argument, he would try to take my daughter and usually drop her off at his mom's house or his grandmother's house. And he said the reason he did that is because he knew that was the thing that I cared the most about. And so he wanted to hurt me by doing what I cared most about. You know, he could do anything to me and it would just slide off my back. But my daughter, he knew the love I had for her. And so in that moment, it also made me realize he could harm her just to get to me, because I'm not giving him the reaction he wants when he does things to me. So he would take it to the extent of harming her just to hurt me, because he knows that's the only way that he could do it. And so when I got the second protective order after, you know, the final incident where we did split up, um, I know that when I went in, they asked me if I had kids. And at the time I was maybe 2 months pregnant with our second child. And so I couldn't list the pregnancy obviously on there, but I did list my daughter on there. And that's when it really hit me, is because not only did I, for the first time, really realize the extent of the abuse that I had endured by having to write it, but they made me highlight why my daughter should be on there. So they will not put the kids on there if you don't have a reason. And so then I had to go through and state why I felt that he was a threat to her and why she should be included on the protective order, especially because we were married. And so technically, when you're married, you have joint custody. And that's when I had to put down every situation. And it made me reflect and realize how many of these situations happened around her. I mean, when we split up, she had just turned 1 year old. And in that stint of her being a newborn to 1 year old, there had been so much abuse that occurred in front of her. And although she may not have been able to process it, I saw where that was leading. And that's the first time I think I really realized how much she was endangered as far as repeating the cycle, because of what was happening in front of her, around her. It had never happened to her, but everything was happening around her. She heard it, she saw it, you know, she was often in the crossfire of it. If, you know, he threw water at me, it'd get on her because she'd be latched onto my leg. And so that's when it really hit me that, yeah, she is in danger and he is a threat to her because he can't control his temper. And so that's kind of what I had to state down and tell the judge. And they also saw it as a threat. And so they included her more than willingly onto that protective order. The situation that became scary is when he battled it, he wanted to take my daughter off of the protective order under the premise of him wanting to see her. And so then we had to go to a separate trial and go into the court for that. And that became a whole ordeal. And I think that was the most emotionally heartbreaking moment for me, is when they did take her off of it, because I didn't have evidence to prove that she was threatened in his presence. And so the judge did remove her off the protective order. But, you know, in that situation, the only reason he battled it was he wanted to get a job where he could use a handgun. And so I also put on the protective order, or actually the judge who originally did it, they put on there that he was not allowed to possess handguns because of the situation that occurred where he pulled the gun out on me. So he battled it to remove that so that he could get a job, you know, where he could have a handgun. But the battle was, you know, under the pretense of wanting to see his daughter. So he never actually took action on that, but that was definitely a scary moment. So I definitely want people to know, just because they're on the order doesn't mean that they can't battle that. You still might have to go to court and prove again why they're a threat to the children, and why the children need to be protected as well.
And to that point, I'm glad you brought that up, because even if the kids aren't on the restraining order or the order of protection, whatever your state calls it, here in Arizona anyway, once they're, so they, it's a process that you kind of go through. And I think you alluded to it about having him served and that sort of thing. At the time that I secured my protection order, you actually have to meet the police there. Mine was in the city of Phoenix and the different metropolitan areas surrounding Metro Phoenix. all handle them a little bit differently based on the size of their cities and what their laws are. But here in the city of Phoenix at the time, you actually had to be present at the time that they were served. So I didn't have to see him, but what happened was the judge granted the order. And then to your point, they list all of the things that they can't do. So they can't contact you by phone. They can't come within so many feet of you. They can't have a handgun. They can't, it'll list out what the restrictions are. And then the process was that I had to tell the police where he was at or where he was going to be. So I had to know where to find him in order to have him served. And then I had to meet the police there and give them the order. They take the order, serve it, bring me back the receipt showing that it had been served. And at that point, then he has a period of time where he can dispute the order. And like to your point about how your ex wanted to fight that, my experience was mine didn't fight it, but we didn't have all those interconnections. There was no child involved. There was no home involved. There were no joint bank accounts involved. There was no marriage, divorce, none of that. So it was relatively a clean process because the day that I went before the judge, my face was black and blue. My lips were busted. I have 2 black eyes. There was absolutely no denying that I had been attacked. So it was from that perspective an easy process. But you're right, writing down all of the things that led up to that and all of the supporting information, some of which I hadn't thought about in quite a period of time from the time that the incident happened until the day that I'm there. And for me, I went to the hospital, to the ER, and the hospital wouldn't release me from the hospital until I'd seen the police. And then there was this whole big ordeal that I experienced with the police department about the value of a protective order. And this was my position. And my position was I chose to pursue the order of protection because my abuser understood that I meant business. He would know that when he got served by this, that the next step was him probably ending up in prison because of it. And so fortunately for me, he didn't dispute it. There was no further contact for a number of years. And the protective order is only in place for about a year. So you have to sometimes, depending on the situation, stay aware of these deadlines and when these things are lapsing and when these things are expiring to protect yourself. But one thing that you said also was that once you realized that your daughter was in jeopardy, then you were like, you know what, I got to do something and so the fact that we'll do things to protect other people, but we won't do things to protect ourselves. Like we're very, as women, protective over our children and our families and, people that we care about, to the point that you were taking a great deal of abuse and in harm's way many, many, many times. But the level of severity that it took for you to move into action was your understanding that your daughter potentially was in jeopardy. At the time that you got your order, what was it, the same process with you when you had to have them served? Did you have to be there and all of that, or was it a different process?
So my process was different. I actually had to pay out of pocket multiple times because I did have to revise the protective order a few times, which meant reserving it while we were going through our divorce process, which lasted almost a year. So for me, there was a few different ways that I had to, or that I was able to utilize. First, it was hiring a private serving company, and I had to look up and pay their fee, and they would attempt to serve him 3 times. The difficult thing about serving him, and that's why I had to do it multiple different ways, is because he didn't have an address. After we split, I had no idea where he went. And so I only knew his mother's and grandmother's address. And that's where I attempted to have him served. And he also stayed unemployed for quite a long time. And so I didn't have a job that I could write down and say, hey, this is where he might be working. I really had no information on where he could be after we had split up. And so come to find out, we figured out where he was staying, and I hired private companies to serve him there. And then throughout the process, there were different reasons why I had to serve him different paperworks other than protective orders. And that's when I noticed that one of the ways you can utilize is in the court. They usually have it's like a mini sheriff's office almost, but you're able to talk to the sheriff's office, and that's where you're allowed to also give them the protective order. So you can make a copy through the court and go to the sheriff's office, give them a copy, and they essentially had the same situation that you had, where they're like, hey, if you see him, you're around him, you know where he's at, give us a call and meet us in the area. And it was really up to me at that point if I wanted to meet them in the area, because they already had a copy of the actual protective order. So I think when you provide a copy to a private service or the sheriff's office now, at least in Arizona, you don't have to physically be at that location or around that location. But I also was told to always keep a copy of the order on me. So that way, if something did happen and he did show up around me, I could call on to anyone to serve him and show them the protective order. So I took the more like expensive route, just because I had gotten to such a state of like being, I hate to call it paranoid, but I was so afraid of him finding me or coming into contact with me that I was like, I will spend any amount of money I need to pre-serve him before it gets to a point where he shows up somewhere and I'm there, and it creates a conflict, and then he gets served on that spot. I was like, I want him to be served well before it even happens. So I think there's a few different routes that you're able to take. There was once that I served him right outside of the courthouse. I couldn't serve him during the court case, but the bailiff grabbed the officer that was on duty at the courthouse, and the second he walked out of those court doors, he was being served immediately. And that's because I had to, for me in my situation, I had to take those actions, because if he wasn't at court and I couldn't see him, I had no idea where he was going to be. And so there was a high chance that he would never be served. And sometimes someone being served depends on the next action that you're able to take. So if I can't serve him child custody orders, I can never pursue him through the court system to pay child support, things like that. So for me, it was very hit and miss. And so I had to take advantage of the opportunities I had to serve him in whatever way I could. So I got pretty familiar with the different ways that I was able to serve him.
Well, and that's the thing too, so with the assault that happened to me in 2012, I was able to serve him because he was enrolled in school at the time. And so I saw his truck. I went drove by the school at the time he was supposed to be at school. I saw his truck. I knew he was there. And so I was able to do it that way. And then I had friends, that came with me, because it was, no matter what the situation, like we say, it's all times aren't bad times. It's a sensitive period where, you're serving this individual. But I will say that the process of making sure they get served is critical, because I had a later incident with another gentleman. I'm going to use that term loosely, where I had to secure a protective order against him. And to your point, he wasn't keeping a job. I didn't know, once we split up, where he was at. I didn't know where he was living. At that point, he had a job, but I couldn't find out where. His people are sort of wrapping their arms of protection around him and guarding, his whereabouts, just as my people were doing the same thing for me. And so that order of protection actually never got served. So he was never, although I was awarded the order, because I was unable to serve him, it's like you don't even have it. the only thing you can do is carry that document with you. And if you see him, try and get that served. And then it starts from the time of service. But the one that I had before that, you know, it was hard because I was a bank executive at the time. And when I returned to work, you know, they're your abusers, they're your life partners, your significant others, your spouses, you know, whatever. They know all your business. So he knew where I worked. It was nothing to for him to be able to come up to my job. So um, I was in a position where I had to tell my peers, my coworkers, my supervisor, um, what happened to me, which I was still kind of banged up when I went back to work a couple days later. But um, then I had to explain to them what the protective order was. This was outside their realm. They're like, "What the heck just happened? Like, what are you talking about?" They were clueless. And so then I found myself in a position of not only being a, you know, quote, quote, victim, as they say on the documents, a survivor in some circles, whatever. But then I suddenly became this educator and this advisor about my own pain and my own struggle and my own personal business. But I had to do it in case he came up to the workplace. And then workplace violence, domestic violence, how those kind of commingle. Like we always say, like it's not that simple. Like everything related to domestic violence is complex. And there's not a simple solution. There's not one right way to do it, one wrong way to do it. Um, but I know you and I have had the conversation that it's just so important. One of the things that the police said to me, um, you know, and we could do a whole day long seminar about what we go through as women during this process, but the hospital wouldn't release me from the hospital until I had seen social workers and all this kind of stuff. So I'm having to replay and retell this story over and over and over. Um, and then they wouldn't release me at all until I had talked to the police. My abuser, the last thing he said to me was, if I get arrested or anyone comes for me, then I will come back and I will kill you. Noted. Got it. So when the police came to the hospital, I refused to give his name, which meant that the state of Arizona now cannot pursue charges against him because I'm not divulging the name. And I told the police officer, I said, well, I'm going to start with a protection or an order of protection. And I kid you not, the police said to me, well, that's just a piece of paper. Why waste your time? It's not going to do anything for you. It's not going to protect you. I bring that up from the standpoint of you have to go with your gut. You know your situation. You know your abuser. You know your level of risk. You know, um, you may not fully know what they're capable of because you probably, but whatever. Like you're the person with the inside track to the information. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself in any given situation. So I told the police, I said, well, he knows that if I take it this far, he'll know that I'm serious and he has a lot to lose. And so I'm going to bet on my information and my knowledge that if I do this and I go down this particular path, that this will squash the situation, which was the case. It could have backfired on me. But what I told the police was I said, granted, it's a piece of paper and no, the piece of paper can't protect me. But if we're honest here, the process would be I give you his name, you go to his house, to his job, whatever. You pick him up, you arrest him. He may or may not lose his job. Max, he's going to spend 24 hours in jail. And at the end of that 24 hours, he's going to get out. He knows where I live. He knows where I work. He knows where my family is. He knows where my friends are. He knows every single place that I might go. And his last words to me were, if anything happens to me, or if the police come for me or they come for my family, I will come back and I will kill you. So, dear Mr. Officer, honestly, you can't protect me either. You can't be with me 24 hours a day. You can't follow me around town to the grocery store and to the gas station and to my job and to my friends and all these different, like, you can't do that. So at best, you and the protective order are almost equal, except for he didn't threaten to kill me if he got served with a piece of paper. But if you show up at his door, I've now put my life at risk, and I put the life of my friends and family at risk in some cases too. So I'm going to bet on the protection order, because the only thing that you can do is come after the fact, take down my statement, and that's if I'm lucky enough to survive it. Otherwise, you're going to be at the morgue notifying my next of kin. Who wins in that? And so I don't mean to take this down, but you know me, so I'm passionate about this. But you have to advocate for yourself. So if anybody's watching this, listening to Cassie's story with her children, protecting her daughter, protecting herself, and understanding like what all of this in totality looks like in your world. The one thing that we both did with this protective order is we advocated for ourselves. And sometimes you're your only advocate. And here at 9 Seconds, like that's what we're here for, is to provide the tools, to provide the resources, to help send you in the right direction, to make sure that y'all have the information that we didn't have, the information that we wished that we had at the time that these things happened to us. And talk a little bit about and I want to be mindful of the time, but talk a little bit, Cassie, about your experience with having to go out and find these resources for you and your kids, and all that looks like.
Tell you that was probably one of the most stressful pieces of the after effect of splitting up. Not because the resources were hard to find, but you do have to be quite diligent and on top of it and actually want to pursue those resources. For me, it was a lot of driving to a lot of different places. I met with a lot of pro bono lawyers, as well as domestic violence lawyers that, because I didn't have any money to really afford anything. And I know that's one of the things that keeps you in the cycle of abuse is the belief and understanding that, okay, this is my situation. I won't have anything. I left that relationship and I walked away with nothing but my child and some random belongings. I had to start completely fresh and new. I didn't have a job at the time. And so I think the most difficult part is working through your own mind and believing that you can't find people that can help you because your situation is just too dire. And so that was one of the things that I had to do. I had to find resources to get on government assistance. And honestly, it was so embarrassing for me to do that because I felt like as a mother, I should be able to take care of my child. And I have one on the way. And now I'm lining up, at the DES office because now I need government assistance just to help raise them. I had to find a lawyer that hopefully I could get good legal advice from, because in my mind, I had been under the influence of his thoughts and what his beliefs were and what he had told me for so long, that when I looked at the whole situation, even knowing the facts, I still felt like the cards were stacked against me and that he was going to come out on top of the situation, because he always came out on top of every situation. And it's because that's what he fed me. And so that's what I believed. So I searched high and low for multiple different opinions from multiple different lawyers, just trying to get advice on like, how do I go through and keep my girls at the end of this? By the time we had finally had our divorce and child custody was sorted, I think my youngest was 1 or 2 months old. And so for me, that was my main focus. I know there's going to be different focuses for different women, but for me, that was the main focus, was how can I continue taking care of my kids and show that I can take care of them by myself and protect them? How do I make sure that they stay out of harm's way? So A lot of it was online researching, and it kind of starts as a funnel. So once you find one good lead from, a program or, a fundraiser or someone who has that information available, once you have that, then it leads you to more information and more resources and more things that can help you. Um, but honestly, and I think that's another motivation to do this video as well as incorporate this into 9 seconds, is because I had to do a lot of my own research, because I could get a free consultation, a 30-minute to an hour talk with someone who would guide me on what to do and guide me on the laws, but they couldn't show up to court and they couldn't, tell the judge why this is such a threatening situation to these kids, to me. And I had no idea what he was doing on his end, if he was going to have a lawyer, if, he was going to show up by himself. And so I did hours and hours of scouring through the Arizona law when it came to domestic violence, when it came to child custody, marriage dissolution, things like that. And that's what I got a lot of my facts off of. One of the important things I'll say is, if you end up going to court and it's over a protective order or any other reason, they give you a lot of paperwork, but it's vital to read through that paperwork, because that's how you show up prepared. I had no idea that you had to write like an accountability statement before you even show up to court, and you're supposed to send that in so the judge can read essentially your statement of facts of what happened before the trial. So that alone will give you an advantage, because now you get to, in a solitaire way, explain your side of the story of what's going on before the judge listens to you guys arguing in court about it. And so it's little things like that, really catching on to reading everything that you're given, knowing what your paperwork is. Always carry around all of your facts as far as like your dates and your incidents, because you will reuse that multiple times to the point like you're not going to want to write it anymore. So different resources like that I scoured through online for, and you can find people that will kind of give you guidance and advice, or direct you to the next place to get more in-depth advice. So that was kind of my experience with it.
Things. And yeah, I remember when you were kind of just starting the whole process. I remember you had a stack of paperwork that was, a mountain, and that by itself can feel so overwhelming, and that by itself can be enough to discourage you and get you to stop.
Yes.
And so the fact that you had the tenacity to continue through the process, like you said, I didn't have a job, I didn't have money. I'm feeling like I'm not a good mother because I got to go ask for assistance and I've got to do all these things. But it's that tenacity that now has kind of brought you through the process. And I know we're going to do a video that kind of talks about and shares your story and your experience, as one of our features for having stories, survivor stories. But just encouraging anyone who is watching this video, and with any of these 31 days of prevention in this whole series, I just want to encourage y'all and really just have one ask of you, and that is, if you hear something, share something. I know that through your experience, and just even as many times as you and I have talked about it, I learned new stuff from you today, right? Just in this short, 43 minutes, 45 minutes. So if you hear something, guys, share something. You just never know what someone's going through, what's going on behind the scenes, what their struggles are. But I can guarantee you that everyone is going through something. And one of the things I'm big on is putting humanity back into the human experience. And although some of this can feel really overwhelming, it can feel demoralizing, it can feel defeating, you can have all of these emotions, but understand this is your human experience. This is a moment in time, and that there are tools out there, there are resources out there, there are individuals out there doing this work who will do their very best to make sure that you have access the information and the resources that you need to be successful. One of the things we say at 9 Seconds is making sure that women are equipped with the tools and the resources that they need to secure their health, safety, and success. And ultimately, we want to see anyone who is in an abusive relationship make sure that they do those things. We want to be able to see you go from that. If you're in that space at the very beginning where you're just starting and you don't know where to turn, you don't know where to go, this is a safe place. This is a safe place. Even if our support advocates or our training advocates here at 9 Seconds don't have the information, we will bust our butts to make sure that we help you get directed in the right place. And y'all are looking, Cassie here, when I tell you this girl is an amazing researcher. She has, once she sinks her teeth into something, there's no turning back, and she's here for you. She's the associate executive director of 9 Seconds. We do this work because we truly, truly care. And we're doing these videos because somewhere, someone just needs that one word. And hopefully we said something today that will motivate you and encourage you to move the needle. So with that, Cassie, do you have anything else that you want to say before we close this out?
The last point that I really wanted to make is it can be scary to start this process because a lot of domestic violence happens behind closed doors where you keep it to yourself. You don't tell anyone. And once you start this process, all of that is made public between your peers, your family, your friends, your workplace, the courts, the systems. Everyone ends up having to hear your story just because it's part of the process. And I want people to know that when you finally are able to share your story, that is what truly starts your healing process. That it feels scary and terrifying to start it, but once you gain the confidence to share your story, that starts the healing process. That starts you getting out of that situation because it's no longer a secret. It's no longer hidden. It's not behind closed doors anymore. So now you can start to get help and move past it. I think for me, that's the last point that I really wanted to make here was, you're going to retell your story a lot and it's going to seem scary, but it helps. It does.
It does. And I'm glad you brought that up. The more you tell your story, the easier it gets to tell your story. And although to your point, like you said, it feels scary, there's something that happens in the process of acknowledging that this is your experience. This is truly your experience. And as much as you don't want it to be that is what it is, but what your experience is in this moment doesn't have to be what your experience is going forward. And I think you touched on it very early on in the video about the generational piece of it and making sure that our kids are protected from repeating these cycle. And, one of the big things we talk about here all the time is that generational system and correcting the generational system, you become the disruptor, and you getting comfortable telling your story allows you to be the disruptor in that, so that the system that was born into you doesn't have to be the system that bears from you. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this video out. Thank you all. If you've stayed with us for this whole time, I thank you so much. I hope that you heard something that was beneficial or valuable to you. And I just only ask, like I said, that you share this video out, like and subscribe. We always add new content to the channel all the time. So in the meantime and in between time, guys, stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, and of course, stay blessed. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Cassie.